If there is a topic of conversation that comes up all the time in DeepRockGalactic, it is the topic of new potential weapons for the classes. Anytime the devs do anything, talk about any kind of update, any kind of event, any kind of announcement, people are always jumping to the assumption that we are hopefully getting new weapons, and for good reason. Ever since they implemented the seasonal structure a while back, we've gotten new equipment every single season, at least up until a point. Season 1 got us new primary weapons, Season 2 got us new secondary weapons. Then at that point, things started to change a little bit. With Season 3, we got new throwable grenades, which was still pretty good and helped out with build crafting a lot. But then in Season 4, we got nothing. We got no new weapons, no new equipment, no anything. Then finally with Season 5, we didn't get any new weapons per se, but we did get new overclocks for each of the primary weapons in the game. And a lot of people are under the assumption that when Season 6 eventually comes out, whatever that does, we'll probably get new overclocks for all the secondary weapons, which is a fair and understandable assumption. But that still doesn't change the fact that a lot of people are curious as to why we're not getting a whole lot of new weapons for the classes and also what those potential weapons could be. And I think a lot of it is they're saving some of the stuff for Rogue Corps because Rogue Corps is going to be having a lot more different weapons than just the ones that we've seen before. But I do think that it is still possible that we could see new weapons for the classes currently in DRG at some point in time down the line. And I kind of want to go through a little bit of a brainstorming session to talk about the potential weapons that each of the classes could get. I want to point out that this in no way, shape, or form is confirming that there is any new weapons. It's not like anybody announced anything. The devs didn't announce anything. Nothing was happening. This is basically just a brainstorming and hypothetical situation and me getting my ideas out there as to what weapons I think would make a lot of sense for each of the classes and how they could potentially be implemented. But if you guys are ready, let's get right into the video. So first, talking about potential new weapons that we might see for the gunner. The gunner obviously has a lot of very large weaponry. He has a big minigun, he has a big autocannon, and he has a giant rocket pod. So very big, very large industrial style weapons. And I think that if they were to add anything, it would still fit into that overall umbrella of big, bulky, and destructive. So the first option that I could definitely see the gunner having is some sort of big, giant railgun, like something where you charge it up and it fires this big beam of energy. And I'm talking like a big railgun, like end of Resident Evil 3 style railgun. Maybe not quite necessarily that big, but along those lines where it's big, it's massive, and it can do just a lot of damage. And I think this would be an interesting addition to the gunner's arsenal because a lot of his weapons are very fast firing, or they're very much about consistent damage that you basically keep the damage going out for as much ammo as you have. The minigun specifically, you're able to just essentially keep flinging bullets, even if you have things like new rotary overdrive that we got in Season 5 and just a couple of other things, or even if you're just really good at pacing the heat, you essentially can have constant damage coming out. And even the autocannon and the hurricane are really good at consistent damage, especially if you build for reload speed or just are really good with reload canceling. The overall premise of those weapons is they're very fast. But with a big railgun, I think it would make for a different playstyle because it would be very big burst damage. So the gunner would have to change the way he plays to a good degree. And it could have the standard railgun system where you charge it up and it fires this big beam and then you have to wait, boom, boom. Like it's just this very large, massive array of energy that he's shooting out. Another potential option that he could have that I feel like could be a little bit awkward, especially with one of his pieces of equipment that he got recently, is a standalone mortar launcher. Basically, if you take the mortar rounds overclock that the Thunderhead got and essentially just turn that into its own particular weapon, I feel like that would also work out pretty well for the gunner specifically. But then you have to think about how is this going to be basically stepping on the toes of mortar rounds? Why would you use mortar rounds on the Thunderhead when you essentially have a weapon that does the exact same thing? They would have to change it up a little bit. They would have to make it function a bit differently, and they would have to give it an identity that is sort of unique to it. And if they did also want to keep mortar rounds the way that it is in the game right now, they would have to change either the way that it works or the way that this new weapon works to where it could basically feel like it's different enough to where you don't have to choose between one or the other. And again, I think it would work out pretty interesting for the gunner because it would be like a slight deviation of the hurricane, but in a bit of a more unique way because it obviously functions a bit differently because gravity is a thing that you have to worry about, because the explosive radius is a thing you have to worry about. I do think it would potentially have a good mix into with the gunner's arsenal, but again, it would have to really have a good relationship with the mortar rounds overclock for the Thunderhead. And then lastly, this is a bit of an odd option, but I do think it could still work, is some sort of revolving Gatling shotgun. It's hard for me to think of any kind of example to compare it to because off the top of my head right now, I can't really think of any weapon that's similar to it, but I feel like just some sort of mass revolving close quarters weapon would work incredibly well for the gunner's arsenal because for the most part, he has good mid to long range options operations, that is where he tends to shine the most. And it's not that he's not good at close quarters, he absolutely is, but it's one of those things where because he's so heavy and because he's so immobile, you kind of don't really want to be involved in too many close quarters operations because it's a bit more tough for him to survive in those situations. So if you give him a weapon that thrives in those sort of close quarters environments, then it would work out very well. Think of, if anybody's played Space Marine 2, think of how the heavy class has access to the multi-melta, which is basically just a gigantic shotgun, and it works out incredibly well for that class because even though you are a ranged-oriented class, even if the enemies get close to you, you still have a very powerful option. Again, I don't really have a metric to compare it to because off the top my head, I can't think of a game that has a big revolving heavy shotgun. It kind of escaping me at this point, but if you guys can think of anything, let me know down in the comments below. Then talking about the Scout, for potential new weapons, the Scout has a couple of different options that I think could work out incredibly well. First, I think, and this might be a little bit hard because of just the way that DeepRock's gameplay is played, but I feel like a true definitive bolt action sniper rifle would be incredibly useful for the Scout. And the reason I say this is because the way that they would have to make it is essentially go all in on the single target damage. Yes, DeepRock is very much about going through big groups of enemies, and that is what you're going to be going through 90% of the time, with obviously some slight focus on taking out high value targets. But what you could do is if they wanted to make a definitive bolt action sniper rifle, like a heavy, like 50 cal rifle, make it just do a ridiculous amount of damage, but it is really only good against single targets. So you don't want to use this thing on like a grunt or a guard or a slasher or something. You want this to be used for your oppressors. You want this to be used for your praetorians, your bulks, your dreadnought. Make it something that is specifically designed for boss takedown and make it essentially useless in every other regard. It's kind of tough to do that because just the way that the enemy dynamics work in DeepRock, it might not necessarily work too well, but I do feel like it could be at least a useful thematic weapon for the Scout to have access to. And then also on the same line as what I talked about with the Gunner, I feel like just a normal railgun rifle for the Scout would actually work out pretty well. Kind of similar to how the Helldivers 2 railgun works. You basically just have a rifle that you charge up, you fire, you reload in between each shot, or you can give it a small magazine in between each shot. Basically anything like that could work incredibly well because they're very accurate, they're very high precision based damage, and that's basically what the Scout wants to do. Something along those lines could definitely work out very well, and the Scout also does have access to some relatively high-tech weapons with the Drak plasma rifle. And even the crossbow also has access to some pretty decent tech attached to it, so I feel like something like this wouldn't be too far out of the realm of possibility for the Scout. And again, similar to the railgun with the Gunner, this would give the Scout really good burst damage aside from just consistent damage, which most of his weapons are revolved around. The M1000 and some of his secondaries can kind of be a little bit different, but this would allow him to have a lot more powerful burst damage as opposed to more consistent damage output. And then lastly, I think something that would really help out with the Scout is a compact SMG type weapon. Something that is more focused on very heavy close range combat. The Scout, more or less, especially when it comes to his primaries, is very ranged oriented. He does have some close quarters options for secondaries with his shotgun and his machine pistols, but I think if he had some sort of close range CQC style machine pistol or submachine gun that could allow him to just basically be this guerrilla fighter, I think that would actually be very useful because you could basically play the Scout in one of two ways, either a long range precision based fighter or a close quarters run and gun type fighter, which I think would actually be a very interesting dynamic for the Scout in conjunction with the rest of the classes. And I think just some sort of like very compact, very small bullet hose of a weapon that just, its rate of fire is just absolutely ridiculous. You dump your clip in about 2 seconds, but it's just able to fling out so much damage very quickly. But obviously its accuracy is very low, essentially like the burst pistol for the Gunner, but just fully auto. I think it would work out incredibly well. By the way, if you're liking this video, consider subscribing because we are very close to 25,000 subscribers, and all the assistance and support really helps me out a lot and lets me do more fun stuff like this. Now back to the video. So talking about the Engineer and his potential new weapons, there are a lot of different ways you could go with the Engineer because his weapons are very out there, and because he is the tech guy, you can kind of do whatever you want. For some reason, my brain is defaulting to the idea of this heavy nail gun type weapon, like something straight out of Killing Floor or Fallout or something along those lines. Just something where he basically just fires these industrial rivets or bolts or something along those lines. I'm not quite sure if it would be like an actual true heavy weapon, kind of like the Gunner's weapons, or it would just be a bulky looking rifle, but something like that I think would fit in pretty well with with the engineer's identity and toolkit. You could have some sort of unique mechanic to it. I don't know how hard it would be to program, but where the projectiles can actually pin enemies to the wall, which could be very interesting. Or maybe they just apply some sort of a slowdown mechanic, because you can make it as if the nails are actually trying to pin them to the ground, or maybe like a bleed effect, something along those lines. Again, you could make it a close to mid-range weapon. Don't give it a crazy amount of range. Again, this would be a very big thematic weapon. I don't think it would necessarily be the most effective thing in the world, but this is more for flavor than function. And again, I think it would just fit really well to the engineer's kit. Another option that I think could actually work out pretty well for him is some type of heavy single shot rifle, kind of like the M1000 for the Scout, but a little bit more heavy duty with a much slower rate of fire and less ammo. Honestly, kind of something akin to like a bolt rifle from Warhammer, where it fires kind of slowly, but it does a lot of direct damage. And you could frame it as if it's like the engineer's pet project that he's been working on. He's putting together a whole bunch of stuff, kind of like what he did with the Smart Rifle, where it's just a huge conglomeration of mechanics and equipment. And he basically just created this contraption, which is like some sort of explosive rifle. I think would be a very interesting idea, because as an engineer main, the one thing that I don't necessarily like about the engineer is he doesn't really have any just general use standard rifle-esque type weapon. He has a shotgun, which is very useful and is very effective. The stubby is a good full auto weapon, but in my opinion, I just don't like the physical design of it. It looks like it would be a secondary weapon, and that's kind of my biggest problem with it. And the Smart Rifle, I do like the design of, but the fact that it functions in such a unique way to where I can't just fire and forget, at least not in the traditional sense. You can fire and forget, but it's not like the Scout's GK2 where you can basically just fire like a normal rifle. I kind of would like something where it is just a standard tactical rifle of some way, shape, or form, but it has to have some kind of an engineer flair to it, and that's kind of what I'm going for with this sort of heavy, explosive single-shot rifle. And then the third option I had for the engineer, which I don't know how this would work, but I feel like it could be interesting, is the addition of some sort of electrical-based weapons like a Tesla rifle. I'm thinking, if you've played Helldivers 2, similar to the arc thrower, where you fire out this big bolt of electricity and it can bounce between enemies. Something along those lines I think would be very interesting, and again on theme for the engineer, because it has range, it has status effect, it is another form of elemental damage, which is great. And it's also something that I feel like would just sort of fit with the engineer in terms of theme and motif. Again, I have no idea how something like this would be implemented or how hard it would be to code or to program or whatever the case may be. But again, keep in mind, we're just brainstorming here. And then finally talking about the Driller. This is probably the hardest one to think of, because the Driller is just so out there with his weapons. He has such wild differences between his weapons, but there is one theme with them, is that they are just very unconventional. And I think probably the first thing that he could use, similar to what we just talked about with the engineer, is maybe just a giant Tesla coil, like something where he can literally just zap out electricity and there's just this big spew of lightning that is just arcing from enemy to enemy, maybe a very close range weapon, a close to mid-range weapon. And it's just phenomenal at just stunning enemies. You'd maybe not necessarily do a whole lot of damage, but you obviously would apply the electrocution status effect, which would just grind swarms to a halt. I think it would be a ton of fun, and it would also kind of complete the engineer's sort of Avatar-esque type playstyle that he has, where he would then have like the four main elements, at least of Deep Rock, at his disposal. He would have fire, ice, corrosive, and lightning. So I think it would be kind of cool. It would definitely fit very well with the Driller's motif and style. And then the second option, which this is going in a bit more of an industrial direction, kind of similar to the engineer, but some kind of big buzzsaw launcher, kind of like a mixture of the breach cutter mixed with his saw blade grenades, something like that, something where you can shoot out these discs that could just cut through enemies. Maybe like the discs have a chance of like sticking into the ground so you can retrieve them to get ammo back, something like that. Just some sort of really wild and ridiculous weapon. I don't really have any ideas or thoughts behind that particular one. I just think it would be a really cool addition. And then the final option I think would be kind of interesting for the Driller, and this is harkening back to, I guess, because I played Fallout recently, but some sort of like harpoon or spike launcher I think would just be hilarious. Some sort of big thing that just fires out these spears or these spikes, or let that just pierce through several different enemies. And it can, again, similar to the engineer's nail gun that I kind of talked about, it would be able to impale enemies to the wall. and just sort of pin them there or slow them down or make them bleed or something like that, but just something hilarious, or maybe even make it explosive. I feel like an explosive harpoon launcher would somehow be the most appropriate thing for the driller. Again, the driller's weapons are really hard to talk about because they are just so out there, but big theme, as I said, is unconventionalness, and these are all very unconventional. And you gotta keep in mind that none of these weapons that I'm talking about are guaranteed. They're not confirmed or anything like that. This is literally just a little bit of brainstorming and speculation as to what could potentially happen. Potentially some of this stuff might come out in Rogue Core, or at least variations of these might come out in Rogue Core. I have no idea, but we do know that Rogue Core is getting new weapons that we haven't seen in normal Deep Rock, so it's very possible that we might see some of this kind of stuff show up there, and if it does very well, they might bring it into DRG normal. We have no idea, so we kind of just have to keep sitting here in limbo and just hoping that when Rogue Core does come out, that it's going to deliver with a lot of new weapons, which I'm sure it will. And if you guys enjoyed this video, please let me know by hitting that like button and consider becoming a member and subscribing today, because we are again getting really close to a big milestone and it would really help me out a lot. Rocket Stone miners, I will see you in the next video.